It was the early hours of August 5th, 1962. Somewhere in Brentwood, Los Angeles, a telephone rang. Then another, and another. By the time the California sun came up over the canyon, Marilyn Monroe was dead, and the people who had made those calls would spend the rest of their lives either contradicting themselves, going completely silent, or disappearing from the public record in ways that were never fully explained. More than 60 years later, those phone calls remain one of the most disturbing and unresolved puzzles in American history. Not because we don't know some of the names attached to them, but because the deeper you dig into what those conversations actually were, the more the official story begins to shake, and then collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. What you are about to hear is not a theory built from rumors and speculation. It is a documented chain of events, confirmed by witnesses across multiple decades, corroborated by federal records obtained through Freedom of Information litigation, and pieced together by some of the most serious investigative journalists who ever looked at this case. The facts on their own are damning enough. So let's go through the timeline carefully, precisely, and let it speak for itself. On the evening of August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was at her Brentwood home on 5th Helena Drive. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was staying there overnight. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, had paid a visit earlier that evening, and by most accounts, left the premises around 7:30. What happened in the hours between that departure and the first emergency call logged at 4:25 in the morning is where the official story fractures into competing, incompatible versions, and where those phone calls become the absolute center of everything. Here is what we know with certainty. Marilyn Monroe made and received multiple phone calls that night. Several witnesses confirmed direct contact with her during the evening hours. Joe DiMaggio Jr., the son of her former husband, Joe DiMaggio, spoke with her by phone and later told investigators she sounded warm, happy, and completely like herself. There was nothing in her voice, by his account, to suggest a woman who was hours from death. That testimony has never been seriously challenged, but it sits in stark, irreconcilable tension with what another caller reported hearing just a short time later. Peter Lawford, the British-American actor and brother-in-law of President John F. Kennedy, through his marriage to Patricia Kennedy, called Marilyn that same evening. By his own account, which he repeated and subtly revised over the years that followed, she sounded different. Her voice was slurring. She was barely coherent, and then she said something that stopped him completely. She said, in words that Lawford repeated with unusual consistency across multiple interviews, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." And then the line went quiet, and then it was dead. Lawford claimed he panicked. He called his personal manager, Milton Ebbins. According to Lawford's account, Ebbins talked him out of going to check on her, talked him out of calling the police, citing the political sensitivity of the situation, and suggesting they wait to see if she called back. She never called back. Lawford did not go. He did not send anyone. He did not pick up the phone to dial emergency services. He sat with that information through the night, and whatever happened inside that Brentwood house happened without a single intervention from one of the last known people to have spoken with her. That failure to act is troubling enough on its own, but Peter Lawford is not even close to the most explosive element of the phone call's story. Because what began emerging in the years following Marilyn's death, through declassified documents, investigative reporting, and confessions made only in the long shadow of old age and approaching mortality, is that the calls made that night were not purely personal. They were political. They were, in significant part, monitored by federal intelligence. And there is substantial evidence that the records of some of those calls were deliberately removed before any official investigator had the chance to examine them. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been surveilling Marilyn Monroe for years before she died. J. Edgar Hoover maintained a thick, carefully assembled dossier on her, not because she had broken any law, but because of who she was intimate with. Her affair with President John F. Kennedy was an open secret inside certain Washington circles by 1962. But what was arguably even more politically combustible was her relationship with the president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. RFK had been in direct contact with her. He had visited her. They had spoken on the phone repeatedly, and by the summer of 1962, multiple credible sources suggest that Marilyn had become dangerously unstable about both of those relationships, feeling used, cast aside, and alarmingly close to speaking publicly about everything she knew. And here is the word that loomed over everything like a storm that wouldn't break: public. A woman who felt humiliated and abandoned, who had kept a personal diary filled with names, dates, and private revelations shared by the most powerful men in American politics, and who was, by the clinical assessment of her own psychiatrist, in a genuinely fragile psychological state in her final weeks. That woman was not just a tragic figure, she was a catastrophic political liability. And everyone inside the Kennedy orbit understood exactly what she represented. Now, here is where the phone records stop being a historical mystery and start being something that looks a great deal like obstruction. Because when investigators and journalists in the years following Marilyn's death attempted to obtain the telephone company records for calls made to and from her Brentwood home on the night of August 4th, they encountered something that should have prompted a major federal inquiry, and never did. The records were compromised. Not entirely missing, some calls were logged, but the records were incomplete in ways that looked less like routine administrative error and more like targeted removal. A Pacific Bell employee reportedly told researchers in the years following the case that records from that specific telephone exchange had been accessed and removed shortly after Monroe's death by individuals who presented federal government credentials. That testimony was documented. It was never officially pursued. It was noted by investigators, acknowledged in journalistic accounts, and quietly set aside without explanation. Think about what that means in plain language. In the investigation of a death that was officially ruled a probable suicide, not a confirmed one, not a settled one, but a probable one, someone with federal clearance may have entered a telephone company office and removed the paper trail of who was communicating with Marilyn Monroe in her final hours. If that is true, it is not a footnote in a complicated story. It is potentially the central crime around which everything else in this case turns. Then there is the question of Robert Kennedy's actual whereabouts on August 4, 1962. For years, his presence anywhere near Los Angeles that evening was flatly and officially denied. The Kennedy organization maintained he was in Northern California, nowhere near Brentwood, but witness accounts, including statements from a uniformed LAPD officer, a hotel employee, and a neighbor living close to Monroe's home, placed Kennedy or individuals closely and verifiably connected to him in the Brentwood area that same evening. None of those accounts were ever tested under oath in any formal legal proceeding. None were ever directly refuted with hard documentary evidence. They were simply outnumbered by the volume of the denial. Private investigator Fred Otash is one of the most significant figures in this entire story, and one of the least publicly discussed. Otash had been hired by Peter Lawford to conduct surveillance on Marilyn Monroe's home and activities. He had the property wired for sound. In the final years of his life, Otash disclosed to trusted associates that he had listened to recordings captured inside that house on the night of August 4th. He described hearing a confrontation. He described a man's voice raised in anger, and Marilyn's voice responding. He described what sounded like a physical altercation followed by abrupt silence, and he refused, even in his most candid conversations, to name the man on those recordings. Fred Otash died in 1992. Whatever he held, tapes, transcriptions, personal notes, memory, died alongside him. The Los Angeles Police Department received the first call reporting Monroe's death at approximately 4:25 in the morning on August 5th. But the official account has never satisfactorily explained why that call came when it did. Eunice Murray gave investigators at least 3 substantially different versions of when she first discovered something was wrong. Early statements suggested around midnight, then she revised to approximately 3 a.m. In a BBC documentary near the end of her life, Murray appeared to edge toward yet another version before visibly drawing back. She died in 1994 without ever delivering a coherent, consistent account of what she witnessed and when she witnessed it. Dr. Ralph Greenson arrived at the property before police were officially notified. A private ambulance reportedly appeared on scene before the one dispatched by emergency services. First responders who entered the house in those early morning hours later described the impression, some more directly than others, that the room had been arranged before their arrival. A scene that appeared, in the words of one account, less discovered than prepared. The gap between when Marilyn Monroe actually died and 4:25 in the morning is precisely where those phone calls live. That window, whether it was 2 hours or 4, was not dead time. People were calling people, decisions were being made, a narrative was being assembled, and by the time the LAPD walked through the door of that Brentwood house, whatever had occurred in those hours had already been shaped into the version of events that would be handed to the world. Marilyn's personal diary, described by multiple people close to her as a red book containing detailed sensitive entries, including names and information shared by powerful men, was never recovered. Her publicist confirmed its existence. Her housekeeper acknowledged it. Multiple friends said she had spoken about its contents in the weeks before her death. It is gone. No estate inventory ever listed it. No official investigation ever produced it. A diary kept by one of the most famous and politically connected women in the world, in the most volatile weeks of her life, simply ceased to exist without a single official explanation. In 1982, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office undertook a formal review of the original death investigation. What that review quietly confirmed was significant. Witnesses had given inconsistent statements that were never reconciled. Physical evidence had been improperly documented. Key investigative leads had not been pursued, and specific telephone records that investigators had been directed to examine had never been followed up on completely. Some of the numbers on that original checklist, the review acknowledged connected to unlisted lines associated with federal government agencies. The 1982 review did not pursue those connections. It acknowledged them and moved on without explanation. The ruling of probable suicide was not changed. There is another dimension to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it concerns the medical examiner's office. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the deputy medical examiner who conducted Marilyn's autopsy, was a meticulous professional who would later become one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the country. But even Noguchi in later interviews expressed that he had been working under unusual pressure during those immediate post-death hours. Tissue samples were taken, standard in suspected overdose cases. But the stomach contents, critical evidence in any overdose case, essential for determining when and how drugs were administered, were either not properly preserved or were discarded before full toxicological workup could be completed. Noguchi later acknowledged this was a serious and irreversible failure. Whether it was a mistake born of institutional chaos or something more deliberate, the result was the same. One of the most important pieces of physical evidence in determining exactly how Marilyn Monroe died was gone before it could be properly analysed. The body of forensic evidence that should have answered definitive questions instead left the core questions permanently open. And once an opportunity for that kind of analysis is lost, it is lost forever. What made the phone calls so uniquely dangerous and so uniquely important to suppress was that they were contemporaneous. They were real-time. They captured something that no amount of post-death management could retroactively shape or alter. A phone call made at 9 p.m. capturing Marilyn's voice and mood is a data point that cannot be edited after the fact. A phone call made at midnight or at 2 a.m., connecting someone powerful to that house, to that night, to those final hours, that is the kind of evidence that determines whether a death is a tragedy or a crime. That is precisely why the records mattered so much, and that is precisely why their disappearance, if deliberate, would have been so strategically necessary for the people involved. And still the documents kept emerging. FBI files released through Freedom of Information requests across multiple decades confirmed the Bureau was actively monitoring Marilyn Monroe's communications and associations in the period immediately preceding her death. Some of those files, even after more than 60 years, remain partially or heavily redacted. The government's stated justifications involve national security and personal privacy. Personal privacy protections for a woman who has been dead since 1962. The question that demands an honest answer is this: whose interests are still being protected? Because whatever sits behind those redactions is something the United States government has determined the public still cannot safely see. And governments only classify information indefinitely when they believe its release would cause real and serious damage to something that still matters. There is also the matter of what those files are known to contain, at least in part. Declassified sections confirm the Bureau tracked Marilyn's movements, her conversations with Kennedy associates, and the activity around her home in the weeks before her death. They were watching her with the kind of systematic attention reserved for national security threats. A movie actress with no criminal record. The only thing that made her a national security concern was what she knew, and who she knew it about. That framing, Marilyn Monroe as a security risk, not a victim, tells you everything you need to understand about how the government saw her in those final weeks of her life. And it tells you everything you need to understand about why the investigation into her death was allowed to be as shallow as it was. Almost everyone who held any part of the truth about that night is now gone. Peter Lawford died in 1984. Ralph Greenson died in 1979. Eunice Murray died in 1994. Fred Otash died in 1992. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June of 1968. Each of them carried fragments. None of them ever gave a complete account, and each one that died took those fragments permanently beyond the reach of anyone still asking questions. What we are left with is this: one of the most recognizable women who ever lived, died in circumstances that were never properly investigated. The phone records from her final night were compromised before authorities could fully examine them. Multiple witnesses told contradictory stories that were never officially reconciled. A personal diary containing sensitive political information disappeared without a trace. A powerful political family had direct documented connections to the deceased and disputed presence near the scene on the night of her death. Federal agents accessed private records immediately afterward, and a government review 2 decades later confirmed the original inquiry was seriously inadequate, without doing anything about it. That is not a theory. That is the factual record, and it has never been explained. The phone calls before Marilyn Monroe died were not just unanswered. They were the one thread that, pulled completely and honestly, might have unraveled something that powerful people spent decades making sure would never unravel. Whether the truth is buried in a redacted federal file, preserved in a private archive waiting to be opened, or died permanently with the last person who stood inside that Brentwood house on the night of August 4th, nobody can say with certainty. What is certain is this: the questions have not gone away. They have only grown louder. And as long as those phone records remain incomplete, those FBI files remain sealed, and those witness accounts remain permanently unreconciled, this story is not finished. Stay right here, because those documents are still coming out, and when they do, we will bring you everything.